Hey, we're going live a little bit early. Mark will be here soon. Savad is unable to join us today. Um, got a few switcheroos. So while we're starting early, let's talk about the schedule again. On Monday, let's see, 3 hours before now, we're going to be continuing our fifth class in the Plato Symposium, the Plato readings. We're going to read all of Plato. We've read four dialogues so far. It's really fun. If you haven't heard, we have a special treat coming up on the 22nd. We're going to be reading, we're all dealing with Plato's first period right now. And we're going to be dealing with the dialogue where Socrates converses with the artist and they discuss the nature of art and inspiration. That's called Ion. And when we do that, we have two pretty cool artists whose names you may have heard of who will be joining us, and we'll be doing interviews with them and looking at their art and some paintings from one and a new album that's coming out from another one. So on Monday, if you start joining us at I think it's 5 p.m. Eastern time, we are doing our Plato readings, dialoguing with Plato. And then right after that's done, we open up a Twitter space for everybody to grab a mic and join if you're not one of the sort of privileged students who's actually in here with us during the classes who get the before show and the after show and the quizzes and the website and the links to extra resources and all that other stuff. If you're just watching on Twitter or YouTube, I suppose, since I technically have them going there, then just make sure you show up on Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern time for the Plato Dialogues. On the 22nd, we got a pretty big surprise and treat coming up on that one. On Tuesdays, we're continuing our backbone course for the year one material, and the year one material is very introductory and formal and academic, and so we're sort of cherry picking essays from different periods of time that all relate to specific questions to get a general overview of the battlefield of various questions. We've done uh, free will and determinism. And again, on the website, there's lots more resources. You can dive in deeper. But we did our free will and determinism section. We did the existence of God. We did a meta ethical question about subjectivity and objectivity and the nature of moral judgments. We did the mind body problem. We are now in the a priori section, which is section 5 of the 8 that we're doing in that backbone course. However, that year one material is accompanied with other classes that are done in very much the same style. On Thursdays at this time, we are working through. I think it'll be our sixth class. We just really got into the meat of it last time yesterday of the philosophy of mind course, and tonight we're doing the philosophy of religion course. And typically, we do these sort of catering to one student at a time, and then other people can watch in and everything. But 1 to 5 people will sort of be on the live stream with me while we're doing it and they have access to all that other stuff. So DM me if you're interested in some of the material. I can talk about other classes we're not doing yet, but that we plan on doing soon if you're interested in that. So this is the philosophy of religion course. We're going to read a really powerful and good and fun essay by an interesting philosopher today in that first section of the philosophy of religion. That's what we're doing on Friday. So Thursday's philosophy of mind, Friday's philosophy of religion. Tuesday, we start 1 hour later than we are starting right now. On Tuesdays, we are doing just the basic backbone first steps introduction. This is sort of a bit of a more of an introduction, get to know the battlefields of these different areas better. Um, Year one type material. Now, in the year two material, we go through from Thales right up to today, and we do a chronological narrative, interpretive story, characterological story of philosophy. And so it's like four major philosophy classes rolled into one, plus a lot extra, and we go way beyond before Thales as well in how we set it up. It's really quite fun. And it has 12 unique lenses that I've developed for understanding philosophy, and four of them at least are ridiculously powerful. And so that's available, but we're not doing that right now. But accompanying that backbone course are the courses like the Plato Symposium, the Dialoguing with Plato, which we're doing on Monday. So we're doing a little bit of year 2 material because on Monday we're doing that. In year 3, the only backbone course that exists right now, although there's other professors putting together things on Quine and other things to have the backbone course for year 3, it's, the one I'm offering is Decoding Zarathustra, where we get to look at all of philosophy again through Nietzsche's lens and with Nietzsche's hammer, and it's really quite a good time. And then the courses that accompany that are a little bit more in depth than even the symposium classes of the second year. They're what we call deep dive classes. So we're going to be doing Kierkegaard and William James and Jung and Jordan Peterson, children of Nietzsche or contemporaries of Nietzsche, um, photographic negatives, twins of Nietzsche, things like that. And we do deep dives means we're really doing deep dives. So tomorrow at 11 p.m. Eastern time for 1.5 hours, that's the only one that we do at exactly the start and end time. We are continuing our deep dive into Jordan Peterson, and we are going to be on our 11th or 12th class for that. And we're only halfway through the second video of his biblical lecture series. So that's pretty awesome. I believe I'm getting a message from Mark, so he'll be here soon. We're also reading Shakespeare in the morning on Saturdays, and we're doing a few other things as well. Oh, there's a big literature class on Wednesdays with the spaces afterwards and everything. So we'll just send him that link again, and I think he'll be here, and we're going to get started. So welcome, and that's we're continuing our year 1 philosophy of religion material right here. Let's see if there's something wrong with the link. He's coming in. Mark,
Just because of my cord.
you go. I'll just take you off there if you don't want to be live. Ready? Here we go. Okay. Hey, it's good to see you, brother.
Yeah, you too.
Oh, I can't hear you for some reason. I think it's your mic, not mine.
How about now?
Okay, one moment. Maybe it's mine. Take a load off.
Testing,
Danny.
testing.
Let's try resetting this.
How about now? Can you hear anything? Because you're muted.
Now I'm muted, but hey, I
I
hear you now. Beautiful.
You hear me? Okay, awesome.
Right, we're in business.
We're in business.
Good time. So I was just doing a little bit of pre-show talk about the schedule and everything. I'm done with that.
Mhm.
I also mentioned to people that these classes are sort of catered to one, at most 3 or 4 people, but really one person at a time. And you're sort of the one that we're catering the philosophy of religion class to. I think you were the most interested in this, and it's partly why we decided to start doing it on Mondays or on Fridays. I mean, what day is it? So I'm super thrilled that we're getting started. You and I'll have a lot of things to talk about after the show. Sorry, we're live already. There was a reason for that. Okay, today we're going to read a pretty long essay, so I think we might not read it all. I think we might just stop halfway through because I happen to know it's pretty dang long. But it's by a really interesting philosopher that I think you're going to like and I want to know more about. So let's just rehearse what we're going over here. So, this is the philosophy of religion section. The first introductory section is all about the nature of faith and the relationship between theology and philosophy and faith, right? Philosophy is about arguments, it's about logic, it's about knowing things, sort of, or trying to. And so, there's a question of wait a minute, if you can't give me a reason for something, isn't that the definition of faith? And if that is, then what room is there inside of religion for that? And so we're looking at different perspectives on that. We started with Thomas Aquinas. Tell me that wasn't a fun excerpt to read. It's pretty fun, right? Okay. So not only was it fun, but in year 2, when we do our year 2 material, I was just talking about one of the guys that we spend a good deal of time getting to read entire works of is Thomas Aquinas. So we'll have a chance to get back to him at some point. But what he's doing is saying, look, okay, yeah, sure, there's lots of religious ideas and theological revelation and cool things, but it doesn't stop a religious person from being philosophical. I tell you what, everybody, I'm going to do philosophy. I'm not going to quote the scriptures. I'm not going to say the scriptures tell me it's true. I'm going to use reason and logic and thinking. And look, hey, I conclude that an awful lot of what was revealed as true happens to also just be something you can understand as true. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. And so he's doing that game. So that's an individual who thinks, hey, he recognizes the philosophy religion thing, and he makes arguments for why revelation would be necessary and appropriate and believable, that it should be a thing, but at the same time, why it's not a bad thing to also come to understand things in another way. Fine. But then we read W.K. Clifford, and it was quite an interestingly it's a very extreme position. Many atheistic types don't go as far as he goes, but his perspective is that in this essay, essentially, it's positively immoral to be the sort of person who will allow yourself to believe something you don't have reasons to believe. Faith is immoral from the start. Not, at least because it makes you the sort of person inclined in your character to go around doing that. And maybe when you have a really important responsibility, you'll say, well, I could just believe that everything will work out. And then you won't do due diligence. So he gave some really wise and interesting stories to illustrate that. And it was kind of fun to read. Then we read Anthony Flou's The Presumption of Atheism. Now, that's not arguing for atheism. It's not saying atheism is true. What he's saying is, I want to set up the stage properly so that we understand that the people claiming there is a God, they're the ones who have to present for us an argument. They're the ones who have to give us a reason to agree with them. So we're not being atheists. It's a weak atheism versus a strong atheism kind of thing. And he's saying, look, the proper way to discuss this conversation would be for us to honestly admit that we have not yet seen enough reason to believe in a God, but then to be open to listening to the arguments of others who can maybe give us good reasons, because we're philosophers. We don't want to know something just because we want to say we know it. We want to actually be convinced. And some people had suggested that, maybe that sounded disingenuous and they didn't really believe him about it. But as we discussed in the after show, he did become religious at the end of his life. And so he was seemingly pretty consistent. He set himself up to accept good arguments and to be convinced by them and that sort of thing. Okay, so that was the third essay we read. Today, we're going to be introduced to Alvin Plantinga, and we're actually going to discuss him specifically more in the after show together. But this essay is called Religious Belief as Properly Basic. Okay, so we've known from some of our other classes what that might mean, right? In other words, it's the sort of thing you shouldn't expect to argue to because it's foundational, it's fundamental, it's the kind of thing that it's not something you argue to, it's what allows you to think in the first place and to make other arguments, that type of a thing. So let's see what he has to say about that. Belief in God is the heart and center of the Christian religion, as it is of Judaism and Islam. Of course, Christians may disagree, at least in emphasis, as to how to think of God. For example, some may emphasize his hatred of sin, others his love of his creatures. Furthermore, one may find, even among professedly Christian theologians, super sophisticates who proclaim the liberation of Christianity from belief in God, seeking to replace it by trust in being itself, or the ground of all being, or some such thing. It remains true, however, that belief in God is the foundation of Christianity. In this essay, I want to discuss a connected constellation of questions. Does the believer in God accept the existence of God by faith? Is belief in God contrary to reason, unreasonable, or irrational? Must one have evidence to be rational or reasonable in believing in God? Suppose belief in God is not rational. Does that matter? And what about proofs of God's existence? A whole bunch of questions he wants to address, so we'll probably not get through the whole essay. It's a good long one, but we'll get through a good bit of it. Many Reformed or Calvinist thinkers and theologians have taken a jaundiced view of natural theology, thought of it as attempts thought of as the attempt to give proofs or arguments for the existence of God. Are they right? What underlines this hostility to an understanding that, on the surface at least, looks perfectly harmless and possibly useful? These are some of the questions I propose to discuss. They fall under the general rubric of faith and reason, if a general rubric is required. I believe Reformed or Calvinist thinkers have had important things to say on these topics and that their fundamental insights here are correct. What they say, however, has been for the most part unclear, ill focused, and unduly inexplicit. I shall try to remedy these ills. I shall try to state and clearly develop their insight, and I shall try to connect these insights with more general epistemological considerations. Okay? We know what he's going to do now, right? So, all these questions about faith and reason. Would it be bad to believe in a God if it was unreasonable? Is it necessary that it be unreasonable because that's what you need for faith, right? That's what the fideists think. Do you need evidence for something to believe in it? All the questions about faith and reason. He says, look, I think there's a group of people that have an insight and we can guess what it is. It's that it's properly basic. So I'm going to try to really flush it out. They didn't do a good job of making their case yet, but they've been getting at something. So I'm going to try to do a really thorough job of explicitly outlining why it is that belief in God is not the sort of thing you should have an argument for. It's rather something that's properly basic. So let's just talk about properly basic for a moment, really quickly, with just one illustration. Yellowness is properly basic. When you look at something and you see yellowness, I don't mean the wavelengths, I don't mean electromagnetic radiation. I mean the experience of yellowness. You just sort of have to know what that is. It's just sort of basic. It's something that you have, and then you use it to analyze the color of the litmus paper when you do other scientific things. But there's no building up to it. It's just one of the fundamental ingredients of how it is that you think and how you navigate. So we won't go into that more. We've talked a lot about that in the mind body problem and philosophy of mind. We'll have a chance to talk about it more on Thursdays when we get to the qualia question. But that's what basic is talking about, something like that. Okay, so let's see what he says. Like the Missouri River, what I have to say is best seen as the confluence of three streams, streams of clear and limpid thought. I hasten to add, rather than turbid, muddy water. These three streams of thought are first reflection on the evidentialist objection to theistic belief, according to which belief in God is unreasonable or irrational because there is insufficient evidence for it. Second, reflection on the Thomistic conception of faith and reason, and third, reflection on the Reformed rejection of natural theology. Okay, let's look at this really quickly. So what he says is, I've got an idea, but it's fed by three rushing streams that become one big river, and they're clear and they're focused and they're strong rivers, and those streams of thought are my thinking about and my reflections upon the way that evidentialists, we looked a lot at evidentialists yesterday when we were doing some of the uh philosophy of mind course. That was a pretty fun class. So evidentialists objecting, hey, show me evidence for God's existence, right? So I thought about what's going on with the nature of that debate and why is it not settleable? And then I thought about the Thomistic relationship between theology and philosophy. That's St. Thomas Aquinas, who we read earlier, right? His idea that, hey, there's some truths and God made it possible for you to get them in revealed form. But for certain people who are capable of doing philosophy, he also made it possible for some of them, not all of them, to be gotten to through reason. And so there is no contradiction between these things. And then also by reflecting on the Reformed rejection to natural theology. Now, Thomas Aquinas is going to give us positive arguments for God's existence, right? So he's going to say, hey, the first group says, hey, give me evidence. And the Thomas Aquinas group, they go, hey, here's some good reasons for believing in God. Bang, zoom. You understand that things are contingent and that can't go back forever, that type of thing. We'll look at those arguments later when we get into the existence of God portion of the of this class. Okay, fine. But then there's this reformed rejection of natural theology, which is actually rejecting the idea of making arguments for God's existence. So he thought about all of those conversations and the nature of them. He said, okay, they flowed, my reflections on all that became clear, and then they got me to where I am. In part one, I shall explore the evidentialist objection, trying to see more clearly just what it involves and what it presupposes. Part two will begin with a brief look at Thomas Aquinas' view on faith and knowledge. I shall argue that the evidentialist objection to the Thomistic conception of faith and knowledge can be traced back to a common root in classical foundationalism. So he's going to see that that's at the root of both of those first two camps. A pervasive and widely accepted picture or total way of looking at faith, knowledge, belief, rationality, and allied topics. I shall try to characterize this picture in a revealing way and then go on to argue that classical foundationalism is both false and self referentially incoherent. It should, therefore, be summarily rejected. In part three, I shall explore the reform rejection of natural theology. I will argue that it is best understood as an implicit rejection of classical foundationalism in favor of the view that belief in God is properly basic. So let's pause. We talked about properly basic a moment. What's this foundationalism? Foundationalism is saying, well, we've got a whole castle of knowledge that we've built up, and it must rest on certain truths that we also know that are the foundation of all of our system. What happens if it all crumbles? Well, we'll rebuild it again, and maybe we're on the wrong foundation, right? But we're found the truths we have, the ideas that we think we know, they're proven because of other ideas we know. And then when you get to the bottom, there's these foundations that you have to have knowledge and be built there. Well, the idea of basic is different than that a little bit. It's going to be in conflict. His notion of basic is going to be different. We also talked in our other a priori class about Quine and his perspective of a lattice work and a network of ideas that are nodes that are more integrated or more fringe than each other. There's all sorts of ways of thinking about how it is that some of our ideas justify others of our ideas. But he's going to say we should reject foundationalism. That's the problem at the root of both the objections to belief in God from the evidentialists and the motivation that Thomas Aquinas had to make arguments which haven't really won the day, even though they're more impressive than people think they are. And we'll have a chance to look at them. And so that's what he plans on doing. Okay. I will argue that it is best understood as an implicit rejection of classical foundationalism. Blah, blah, blah. What the reformers meant to hold is that it is entirely right, rational, reasonable, and proper to believe in God without any evidence or argument at all. In this respect, belief in God resembles belief in the past, in the existence of other persons, and in the existence of material objects. Okay. Do you believe in the past? Yes. Okay. Prove that there was a past and that you didn't snap into existence right now with all your memories programmed into you. I can't. So people say, okay, but you still believe it, right? Yeah, I still believe it. It's still a part of my knowledge network or belief system or something. Prove that other people have minds. Well, I know I have a mind and it's like something to be me, but everybody else could be a robot for all I know. I mean, I'm not inside their subjective experience by definition. And so I don't know that they have minds. I can know that they have brains, right? These are things that you can't actually prove in philosophy. There's actually quite a lot of them. And so one of the responses or the ways of dealing with that is to say these things are properly basic, but we'll justify that they're properly basic, right? Saying it's properly basic isn't just saying, well, I throw up my hands, I'll just keep believing it anyway. They're going to justify why it's the sort of thing that you can't have an argument for, but that it's still reasonable and proper to believe in it. All right. Even the existence of material objects, as we've seen with Hume and Kant talking about all of this, and Socrates as well, we understand that that could be a properly basic necessity. I'm sorry, did you come back on because you just unmute and interrupt me at any time if you feel?
Yeah, we'll do.
I shall try to state and clearly articulate this claim and in part four to defend it against objections. Okay, that's his introduction. Here's what he plans on doing. Part one, let's look at the arguments of the evidentialists for not believing in God. The evidentialist objection to belief in God. My first topic then is the evidentialist objection to theistic belief. Many philosophers, Clifford, Blanchard, Russell, Scriven, Flew, to name a few, have argued that belief in God is irrational or unreasonable or not rationally acceptable or intellectually irresponsible or somehow noetically below par because, as they say, there is insufficient evidence for it. that group. That's what they're always about. Show me the evidence. Bertrand Russell was once asked what he would say if, after dying, he were brought into the presence of God and asked why he had not been a believer. Russell's reply, I'd say, not enough evidence, Lord. What? Why did you hide yourself? That type of thing, right? Not enough evidence, God. Not enough evidence. We may have our doubts as to just how that sort of response would be received, but Russell, like many others, held that theistic belief is unreasonable because there is insufficient evidence for it. Part A. How shall we construe theistic belief? But how shall we construe theistic belief here? I have been speaking of belief in God, and this is not entirely accurate. For the subject under discussion is not really the rational acceptability of belief in God, but the rationality of belief that God exists, that there is such a person as God. And belief in God is not at all the same thing as belief that there is such a person as God. To believe that God exists is simply to accept as true a certain proposition, perhaps the proposition that there is a personal being who has created the world, who has no beginning, and who is perfect in wisdom, justice, knowledge, and power. According to the book of James, the devils do that, and they tremble. The devils do not believe in God, however, for belief in God is quite another matter. One who repeats the words of the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, and means what he says is not simply announcing the fact that he accepts a certain proposition as true. Much more is involved in that. Belief in God means trusting God, accepting his purposes, committing one's life to him, and living in his presence. To the believer, the entire world speaks of God. Great mountains, surging oceans, verdant forests, blue sky, and bright sunshine, friends and family, love in its many forms and various manifestations. The believer sees these things and many more as gifts from God. The universe thus takes on a personal cast for him. The fundamental truth about reality is truth about a person. This is impressive. I like how he's going to explicitly draw this out. So, we've talked before about the mythopoetic way of thinking, and we're going to talk a lot about it when we start the year two backbone course. So, we've just been referencing it. But the way that people thought, communicated, investigated their world, tried to make sense of the world around them, apart from science and apart from propositional philosophical arguments, there is a way. We actually do it today most of the time. Everything that was the most valuable from very long periods ago was of that type. That way of viewing the world, we often mock it scientifically. We say, "Oh, you're personifying everything." How silly of you. They might respond to us and say, "Why are you objectifying everything?" That's a silly notion there. But both views might be useful, but the personification. So imagine this. Imagine saying, "Okay, tell me what's true about the world," and you give me all the trillion facts about things, but none of them relate personally to me. But I'm in the world, and I have to understand how to relate properly to nature and to society and to the family and to the divine and all these things. And so it's that other language that they're approaching. We won't go into that any more in depth. We do a lot with that tomorrow when we talk about Peterson and his approach, but we've talked a lot about it in other places. In any event, what he's saying here is that for the contemporary Christian, they have a relationship with a personality as they're investigating the world, and so the world itself again becomes mythopoetic. It becomes the world for a contemporary Christian becomes personified because God is a person that they're relating to in it and through it. Okay, so believing in God is indeed more than accepting the proposition that God exists. It's not propositional. That way of thinking isn't propositional. He's saying these are two different things. But if it is more than that, it is also at least that. One cannot sensibly believe in God and thank him for the mountains without believing that there is such a person to be thanked and that he is in some way responsible for the mountains. Nor can one trust in God and commit himself to him without believing that he exists. As the author of Hebrews says, he who would come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So, belief in God must be distinguished from the belief that God exists. Having made this distinction, however, I shall ignore it for the most part, using belief in God as a synonym for belief that there is such a person in God. The question I want to address, therefore, is the question whether belief in God, belief in the existence of God, right, the propositional factual question, is rationally acceptable. But what is it to believe or assert that God exists? Just which belief is it into the rational acceptability of which I propose to inquire? Which God do I mean to speak of? The answer in brief is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Jewish and Christian revelation, the God of the Bible. To believe that God exists, therefore, is first of all to hold a belief of a certain sort, an existential belief, to believe that something exists. To assert that God exists is to make an assertion of a certain sort, an existential assertion. It is to answer at the most basic level the ontological question, what is there? It's an ontological question, right? He's separate. This is the one he wants to focus on. The propositional ontological question. He says real faith has to do with all that other stuff. Maybe we'll return to it. But the question that we're really dealing with now, which is primary to that one, he says the scriptures say, at least from his Christian perspective, you have to believe that there is such a personality before you could try to relate to him. And so I want to ask the ontological question. Ontological questions. What is there? Well, I'm going to say ontologically, there is such a person. I want to see what does it mean to say such a thing? This may seem excessively obvious. I would not so much as mention it, were it not for the fact that some philosophers and theologians seem to disagree. Oddly enough, they seem to use the phrase belief in God and belief that God exists in such a way that to believe in God is not to hold any such existential beliefs at all. Much of what Rudolf Bultmann says, for example, seems to suggest that a belief in God is not at all to believe in God is not at all to believe that there exists a being of a certain sort. Instead, it is to adopt a certain attitude or policy, or to make a kind of resolve, the resolve perhaps to accept and embrace one's finitude, giving up the futile attempt to build hedges and walls against guilt, failure, and death. And according to the philosopher Richard Braithwaite, a religious assertion is, quote, the assertion of an intention to carry out a certain behavioral policy subsumable under a sufficiently general principle to be a moral one, together with the implicit statement, but not necessarily the assertion, of certain stories. But then it looks as if, according to Braithwaite, when the Christian asserts, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, he is not, contrary to appearances, asserting that he believes that there exists a being of a certain kind. Instead, he is asserting that he intends to carry out a certain behavioral policy. As I use the phrase belief in God, however, that phrase denotes a belief, not a resolve or an adoption of a policy. And the assertion that God exists is an existential assertion, not the assertion of an intention to carry out or a certain policy, behavioral or otherwise. To believe or assert that God exists is to believe or assert that there exists a being of a certain very special sort. Okay. So one thing that we were introduced to, and this is a long essay, is that he really wants to make this case, and he's not going to step over anything that doesn't need to be addressed. So he's addressing all sorts of different categories as he moves forward to be very clear about his position. It's a very good thing to do, by the way. If you want to argue with someone, it's better that they have the guts to say, "This is exactly where I'm standing, and I'm not over here, and I'm not over here, and don't misunderstand. I'm going to defend this ground over here," and then just set up a good defense of it. So a being of a certain sort who actually exists ontologically. That's the question he wants to focus on, that propositional question. Well, what sort of being? Special sort, right? What sort? Some contemporary theologians, under The baneful influence of Kant apparently hold that the name God, as used by Christians and other, denotes an idea or a concept or a mental construct of some type of some kind. The American theologian Gordon Kaufman, for example, claims that the word God raises special problems of meaning because it is a noun which, by definition, refers to a reality transcendent of and thus not locatable within experience. In a striking echo of one of Kant's famous distinctions, Kaufman distinguishes what he calls the real referent of the term God from what he calls the available referent. The real referent and the available referent, the thing the word refers to is. So this is some other philosopher who's got this idea and he's probably going to disagree with it. Here we go. Quote, a real referent for God is never accessible to us or in any way open to our observation or experience. It must remain always an unknown X, a mere limiting idea with no content. For all practical purposes, it is the available referent, a particular imaginative construct that bears significantly on human life and thought. It is the available God whom we have in mind when we worship or pray. It is the available God in terms of which we speak and think whenever we use the word God. In this sense, God denotes, for all practical purposes, what is essentially a mental or imaginative construct. Now, we're going to read lots of essays in this course. If anybody's listening and saying, wait a minute, why are we just quickly bringing up all sorts of perspectives that seem valuable or valid to me and then just dismissing them? Well, every time we read an essay, we're going to focus on the specific author and try to understand them. He's doing a very good job. We will have plenty of time to see representatives from all these other perspectives that he's saying. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about an idea. I'm not talking about an idea that's as close to the real idea as we can get or just different from it, but we can never get to the real idea. I'm talking about a thing that you can know that I'm dealing in that. So we'll go back to all these other things he's talked about from other perspectives at another time. But right now he wants to say that's not what I'm talking about. So here we go. Professor John Hick makes a similar suggestion in his inaugural address at the Claremont School of Theology. He suggests that when Christians speak to God, they are speaking to a certain image or mental construction or imaginative creation of some sort. Now, they're not saying that because there is no God in their mind. They're saying because God's so infinite and beyond us, there's actually theological precedent for this. I think there's a Jewish sect of theologians who have this idea that the God of the Bible is the God that the real God created because it was close enough to be something we could relate to, but he's really far. He's too much for our brains to even deal with. We're not endorsing that. We're certainly not endorsing it. We're not criticizing it. We're just going to see what Alvin Plantinga says to dismiss it, I think. Okay. Now, these are puzzling suggestions. If it is Kaufman's available referent in terms of which we speak whenever we use the word God, and if the available referent is a mental or imaginative construct, then presumably when we say there is a God or God exists, we are affirming the existence of a certain kind of mental or imaginative construct. First of all, he might have said that how could that not be true? The thing I'm imagining exists. What is it? Well, it's a thing I imagine. Okay, if that's all it's referring to is the thing you imagine, then I can grant that you are imagining something. But what happened to the question, does God exist anymore? Okay, but surely that's not what we're talking about, he says. And when Christians say that God has created the world, for example, are they really claiming that an image or imaginative construct, whatever precisely that may be, has created the world? That seems to be at best preposterous. In any event, the belief I mean to identify and discuss is not the belief that there exists some sort of imaginative construct or mental construction or anything of the sort. It is instead the belief, first, that there exists a person of a certain sort, a being who acts, holds beliefs, and has aims and purposes. This person, secondly, is immaterial, exists a se, is perfect in goodness, knowledge, and power, and is such that the world depends on him for its existence. Okay. Now, he hasn't argued against any of those other perspectives. He's brought them up to say that's not what I'm talking about. What I want to do is I want to investigate, is it rational? Is it reasonable to believe in a real person who exists ontologically that I could know personally? But just to first believe that he actually does exist and he has the types of qualities that the Christians ascribe to him. I want He's not even arguing that that's true. He's saying, I don't want to talk about anything except that. And I want to ask, is it rational to believe such a thing? Okay, part B, objections to this type of theistic belief. Now, many objections have been put forward to belief in God. First, there is the claim that, as a matter of fact, there is no such thing as belief in God because the sentence God exists is strictly speaking nonsense. This is the positivist contention that such sentences as God exists are unverifiable and hence cognitively meaningless. If you want to know more about all of that, check out yesterday's class. That's exactly what we're looking at in our philosophy of mind course. And we spent a lot of time on the Vienna Circle who came up with this perspective. Also, if you really want to know more about it, hang on for Dr. Tartaglia, who's coming to join us soon with three powerful classes, one of which is a deep dive into Gödel and his incompleteness theorem. It's a wild ride for anybody who doesn't even know anything about math or knows a lot about math. You're going to learn about formal systems. You're going to learn about everything you need to know to even derive, which is quite a feat, to derive the Gödel incompleteness theorem. It's really going to be a fun class. So if you really want to know more about it, there's that. Plus, his Quine class talks about it. Okay. But in any event, there's a group of philosophers who say, we have analyzed the way that people use language, and the meaning that is transmitted between them always is translatable into statements about physicalistic things, which could be verified. And there is no meaning apart from that that is transmitted between them. And so, if a statement has meaning, it can be translated into that type of a statement without losing or changing its content. And therefore, statements which can't be verified in any way through physical means are meaningless by definition. That's their view. Okay. He says, and hence cognitively meaningless, to use their charming phrase, in which case they altogether fail to express propositions. They're faux propositions, say the Vienna Circle. On this view, those who claim to believe in God are in the pitiable position of claiming to believe a proposition that, as a matter of fact, does not so much as exist. The proposition itself doesn't exist. It couldn't be true or false. This objection, fortunately, has retreated into the obscurity it so richly deserves, and I shall say no more about it. Okay. The logical positivists have failed, and so he doesn't feel any reason to prove that they're not correct. Okay. Second, there is the claim that belief in God is internally inconsistent in that it is impossible, in the broadly logical sense, that there be any such person as theists say God is. For example, theists say that God is a person who has no body, but nonetheless acts in the world. Some philosophers have retorted that the idea of a bodiless person is impossible, and the idea of a bodiless person acting is obviously impossible. Some versions of some of these objections are of great interest, but I do not propose to discuss them here. Let me just record my opinion that none of them is at all compelling. So far as I can see, the concept of God is perfectly coherent. Third, some critics have argued that the existence of God is incompatible with other beliefs that are plainly true and typically accepted by theists. The most widely urged objection to theistic belief, the deductive argument from evil, falls into this category. According to this objection, the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good God is logically incompatible with the presence of evil in the world, a presence conceded and indeed insisted upon by theists. For their part, theists have argued that there is no inconsistency here, and I think the present consensus, even among those who urge some form of the argument from evil, is that the deductive form of the argument of evil from evil is unsuccessful. Now, he's setting the stage here. So if you're feeling like, wait, you're just going in one paragraph about all these things that you're not even disproving them. You're just bringing them up and saying, my judgment is that that doesn't work. Most people have let that one die. This one, people agree. Okay. It's like, well, what are we doing? Well, in this philosophy of religion course later, we're going to have a whole section on the problem of evil, right? So we'll have plenty of time to talk about these things. It's not the point of this essay. But what he wants to do is say, okay, now these are the types of things that people use to attack it. I haven't found a deductive, conclusive argument that they're right, which is what would be needed to find what's he interested in. Is it actually irrational to believe? Well, the only way it could be irrational is, well, one of the ways first is if you had an argument that you knew, like deduct, like this is conclusive for sure. It doesn't make sense. It's incompatible with itself. It's incoherent. It's meaningless, whatever. And he's saying, look, check the rest of the literature. Nobody believes that. Just like the logical positivist didn't win the day, just like the positive arguments for the existence of God didn't win the day. The idea that the argument of evil from evil proves that there is no God, the theologians have responses to that, and it's an ongoing conversation. It's not over, and nobody thinks that they won the day and it's over. So therefore, we can move on because he has another purpose in mind for this. Okay. More recently, philosophers have claimed that the existence of God, while perhaps not inconsistent with the existence of the amount and kinds of evil we actually find, is at any rate unlikely or improbable with respect to it. That is, the probability of God's existence with respect to evil is less than that of its denial with respect to evil. Hence, the existence of God is improbable with respect to what we know. But if theistic belief is improbable with respect to what we know, then, so goes the claim, it is irrational or intellectually improper to accept it. Okay, so now there's a different standard. Some people say, I can prove that it's totally wrong about God. But other people are saying, no, wait a minute. I'm not saying I can prove deductively. That's a high standard. I'm saying here's a whole mountain of reasons and evidence I've collected for why you're probably wrong. And what do you got? Three or four small reasons, maybe none on the other side. If that's the way the scales balance out, it's still irrational to believe it, right? We're not saying, you've proved it perfectly or something. Okay. Although this objection, the probabilistic argument from evil, is not the central concern here, it bears an interesting relation to one of my main topics, the question whether belief in God is properly basic. So, suppose we briefly examine it. The objector claims that 1, God is the omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good creator of the world. It's impossible or unlikely, is impossible or unlikely with respect to the amounts and varieties of evil we find in the world. Perhaps some of the evil is necessary to achieve certain good states of affairs, but there is so much evil, much of which seems, on the face of things, utterly gratuitous. The objector claims, therefore, that 1 is improbable or unlikely, given 2, that there are 10 to the 13 terps of evil, where the terp is the basic unit of evil, TURP, equal, as you may have guessed, to 1 over 10 to the 13th, the evil of the actual world.
Pause.
Yeah.
So he doesn't deny at all. He doesn't debate that the existence of God, that God and evil can exist at the same time. He's not arguing against that at all. He's just saying somewhere there's an arbitrary threshold of evil, and over a certain over a certain point, it's impossible for God to exist. Am I getting that right?
This isn't his argument. He's saying
The
some people
the
argue
the
like this.
argument, correct?
Okay.
The argument.
And so first he said the first group come in and say, I can prove there's no God if I find one bit of evil.
Right.
If there's even one bit of evil, look, I found some. That proves God doesn't exist because he's all knowing and all powerful, and those are
Mhm.
incompatible. He says, look, everybody knows that didn't, that maybe it's interesting. We should examine it. Maybe it kind of works or it could be convincing to you, but it didn't like win the day where all logicians and philosophers say, okay, we give up on this God idea. It's not really that successful. Putting that aside, there's another group of people who are arguing like this. It's kind of interesting. He says there are 10 to the 13 terps of evil, and a terp is the basic unit of evil, which is equal, of course, to 1 over the 10 to the 13th of all the evil in the world, by definition, of course, because we have the total amount of evil is 10 to the 13th of them. Okay. And yeah, this argument is exactly the way you characterized it. It's saying, look, okay, God and evil, all powerful, all knowing, all good God, the type of God you're talking about, he could obviously exist with evil. You've given your theodicy, I think that's what they call it, the theodicies that we've looked at and we will look at in the future, saying here's why it makes sense that God would allow this or whatever. It's logically consistent. They're not trying to convince you to believe in their God. They're just saying I can make an argument that this is not logically inconsistent. And yeah, you did a good job on that. So we'll get rid of the deductive foolproof argument. But hold on a second. there's a lot of evil around here. Okay. I mean, that would work to explain away a little bit of evil. But all I'm saying is, do we need this much? It looks like a lot of it is superfluous. It's more than needed. Um, that's a lot of evil. So the more evil I find, the less likely that your God exists. That formula still works. You can explain away a little bit with your explanations, but the more there is, the less likely. And I find a lot. There's a lot of evil. Since there's a lot of evil, it gets less and less and less likely that there's a God. If it gets so unlikely that there's a God, it's very improbable, say 10% or 1% or 0.00001%, whatever the argument is, if it's really unlikely, then it's still irrational for you to believe in him, even if I haven't proven he doesn't exist. Yeah, that's exactly the argument that he's now going to address. So, suppose we stipulate for purposes of argument that one is in fact improbable on two, right? The existence of God as all being and all good is improbable given how much evil there is. Let us agree that it is unlikely, given the existence of 10 to the 13 terps of evil, that the world has been created by God who is perfect in power, knowledge, and goodness. What is supposed to follow from that? How is this to be construed as an objection to theistic belief? How does the argument go from there? It does not follow, of course, that theism is false, nor does it follow that one who accepts both 1 and 2, and let us add, recognizes that 1 is improbable with respect to 2, has an irrational system of beliefs or is in any way guilty of noetic impropriety. For it could be, obviously enough, that 1 is improbable with respect to 2, but probable with respect to something else we might know. For example, both that 3 Fige is a Frisian, and 9 out of 10 Frisians cannot swim. That's a third statement. And Frike is a Frisian lifeguard, and 99 out of 100 Frisian lifeguards can swim. Is it plausible to hold that Frike can swim? Okay. That is it. Look, how unlike, right? All you gave me were two propositions. They're like these, right? God's all knowing and all powerful. There's a lot of evil in the world. And you're saying, well, that makes it very unlikely. Well, but there could be a third thing you could know that would totally not make it unlikely. That's not enough to know that it's unlikely, right? Here's a true fact: 9 out of 10 bank robberies are unsolved. If you decide you want to go out and rob a bank, get a bunch of money, and leave, you have a 90% chance of getting away with it. 9 out of 10 bank robbers are caught. That's also a true statement. 90% of bank robbers are caught. Why? Because if you really need money and you break the rules and you say, I'll just go rob a bank and it works, you run out of money again and you do it again and you do it again and you do it again. And by the 6th to 10th time, you're caught, right? If you're really good, you can get to like 14 times, but you're going to get caught, right? So it's like, wait a minute, 9 out of 10 bank robberies are unsolved. I bet you it's even worse for arsons, right? Because arson burns down all evidence. So it's probably like 90, I don't know what it is, I'm making it up. 99 out of 100 arsons are not solved. But the arson set 1,000 fires. You caught him. You caught him before he made it to 200. You know what I mean? Like arsons are rare and they're weird and they're not going to stop doing it, kind of a thing, right? So so there could be another fact, right? And this works. Fike is a Frisian lifeguard, and 99 out of 100 Frisians cannot swim. Frike is a Frisian lifeguard, and 99 out of 100 Frisian lifeguards can swim. So it's still plausible to hold that he can swim. It's probable with respect to 4, but improbable with respect to 3. If furthermore 3 and 4 are all we know about Frike's swimming ability, then the view that he can swim is epistemologically more acceptable for us than the view that he cannot, even though we know something with respect to which the former is improbable. Indeed, we may very well know both statement 3 and statement 5. I'll just read them again since I can look at them here and you can't as I'm reading it. 3 gays are freezing and 99 out of 100 of them cannot swim. And statement 5, 3 gay can swim. So indeed, we might very well know both 3 and 5. We might very well know a pair of propositions A and B such that A is improbable on B. So even if it were a fact that 2 is evidence against 1, or that 1 is improbable on 2, that fact would not be of much consequence. But then, how can this objection be developed? How can the objector proceed? Presumably, what he means to hold is that 1 is improbable that God exists, right? So every time he says 1, he means his first statement that an all powerful, all knowing, all good God exists. Not just on 2, which is the statement there's a heck ton of evil in the world, but on some appropriate body of total evidence, perhaps all the evidence that the theist has, or perhaps the body of evidence he is rationally obliged to have. The objector must be supposing that there is a relevant body of total evidence here, a body of evidence that includes 2, and his claim is that 1 is improbable with respect to this relevant body of total evidence. It's the only way the argument would make sense is if the original person meant it that way, meant you know everything you need to know that there's no way out of the fact that if there's this much evil, it's very improbable that God exists. Suppose we step back a moment and reconsider the overall structure of the probabilistic argument. The objector's claim is that the theist is irrational in accepting belief in God because it is improbable with respect to how much evil there is in the world. I'm just going to say that instead of saying 2 every time. The proposition that there are 10 to the 13 terps of evil, a proposition whose truth the theist acknowledges. As we have seen, however, even if the existence of God is improbable with respect to that statement, that fact is utterly insufficient for demonstrating irrationality in the theist structure of beliefs. There may be many propositions A and B such that even though A is improbable because of B, we can nonetheless accept both in perfect propriety, as with his example above. What the objector must be supposing then is something like this. For any theist T that you pick, there is a set of propositions T that constitute the total evidence. And now, for any proposition A that the atheist accepts, there is rational he is rational in accepting A only if A is not improbable with respect to T. And the objector's claim is that the existence of God is improbable with respect to T sub I'm so blind. T sub S. My bad. I was wondering why he used the same symbol for both. I was thinking hopefully you're imagining one lowercase and one capital, but the subscripts were hard to see in this light. Let's read that again. A belief is all right for any theist T sub S. Oh Jesus. I'm sorry, go back. For any theist T that you pick, there is a set of propositions T sub S that constitutes his total evidence. And now, for any proposition A that the theist accepts, he is rational in accepting A only if A is not improbable with respect to T sub S. And the objector's claim is that the existence of God is improbable with respect to T sub S for any or nearly any theist. He's just restating more formally what he said before. The argument must be you know enough to know that the improbability based on how much evil there is all that you need to know, and that there isn't a third statement out there that would make it more probable. But suppose that we say that T sub S is the theist's evidential set, how much he has witnessed to, basically, right? This is the set of propositions to which, as we might put it, he holds his beliefs are responsible. Okay. A belief is rationally acceptable for him only if it is not improbable with respect to all of the beliefs he has which are rationally responsible. Now, so far, we have not been told what sorts of propositions are to be found in T sub S. Perhaps these are the propositions the theist knows to be true, or perhaps the largest subset of his beliefs that he can rationally accept without evidence from other propositions, or perhaps the set of propositions he knows immediately, knows but does not know on the basis of other propositions. That's what I mean. To know immediately is to know something, but not on the basis of other propositions. However exactly we characterize this set T sub S of all the things he knows, reasonably, the presently pressing question is this: why cannot belief in God be itself a member of T sub S? Ooh. Okay, now we can see where he's going with this, right? He's saying the only way the argument of there's too much evil for it to be rational to believe in a God could work is if it's claiming that with all the stuff you know, there's no other statement that would make it reasonable, even though it's unreasonable just in light of that one fact. But to do that, it means that you have to start with a whole bunch of things that you know, presumably even basic things that you know, things that you don't know because of other propositions, in order for you to be allowed to add there is a God to that set. And he says, well, now, wait a minute. Yeah, sure. But why can't there is a God be a properly basic idea that you have in the things that you know to begin with so that you don't need justification to include that proposition? Hmm. Why cannot belief in God be itself a member of T sub S? Perhaps for the theist, for some theists at any rate, belief in God is a member of T sub S, in which case it obviously will not be improbable with respect to T sub S. Perhaps the theist is entirely within his epistemic rights in starting from belief in God, taking that proposition to be one of the one's probability, one of the taking that proposition to be one of the one's probability with respect to which determines the rational propriety of other beliefs he holds. If so, the fact, if it is a fact, that theistic belief is improbable with respect to the existence of evil does not even begin to show that the theist is irrational in accepting it. The high road reply to the probabilistic argument from evil, therefore, leads directly to one of the questions I am fundamentally concerned with. What sorts of beliefs, if any, is it rational or reasonable to start from? Which beliefs are such that one may properly accept them without evidence? That is, without the evidential support of other beliefs. One who offers the probabilistic argument from evil simply assumes that belief in God does not have this status, but perhaps he is mistaken. So now we see why he did all the work he did before. He's not trying to prove the existence of God in this paper. What he's trying to prove is that the existence of God as a proposition is something that the theist is rational in taking as a properly basic belief. He hasn't done that yet, but he's starting to get there. And he said, the way I'm going to get there is I'm going to take three streams of thought that came to me as I was examining these other categories. The first one was the category of evidentialist objections to the belief in God. So the reason why he went through a bunch of them and then didn't address them, but just said, look, they don't totally prove it's not true. We can talk about that another day. Unless they do, we don't have to deal with it. But then he said, now I was thinking about this other class of these evidentialists who say it's not that it definitely couldn't be true, but it's that it's improbable. And I started thinking, well, okay, what does that require? Well, it requires that I know enough to know that just because something's improbable with respect to something else, that there isn't something else that would still make it likely, right? 9 out of 10 bank robberies are unsolved, 9 out of 10 bank robbers are caught, right? So if I say John robs banks, and all I tell you is 9 out of 10 bank robberies are unsolved, you might think, wow, where is he? No, he's in prison. Well, how come? Because he robs banks. But that's not likely. John's a smart guy and he's clever and he's strong and he's, what? What? Well, he robs banks, so he's in prison. But that's not likely. 9 out of 10 bank robberies are unsolved. Yeah, but there's something else you need to know. If you keep robbing banks, you're going to get caught. 9 out of 10 bank robbers get caught. So he's saying those two statements, just because one is improbable in relation to the other, requires still that that there is nothing else that would make it probable yet anyway. And so what the argument must be is that the theist not only knows these two statements, rather knows that the statement God exists is improbable with respect to how much evil there is in the world, but he knows a lot of other things. And some of the other things he knows are properly basic things. And then he says, now hold on a second. The person making this argument must assume that the idea God exists is not one of those properly basic ideas, because he's saying it's irrational to include it in your collection of knowledge if it doesn't fit in well. Wait a minute, hold the freaking phone. What if it was already in there to begin with? What if it's one of the things I know without justification, that I don't need to justify bringing it in? I use it to understand other things, that type of thing. So he hasn't proven it yet, but he's saying, I was thinking about that argument and realizing that there was a hole in it. All right, now he's going to move on to the second strain of thought that got him to this idea that belief in God is properly basic. That is the evidentialist. Oh, no, we're still on evidentialists. Okay, never mind. The evidentialist objection stated. Okay, now suppose we turn explicit attention to the evidentialist objection. Many philosophers have endorsed the idea that the strength of one's belief ought always to be propositional in the to the also ought always to be proportional to the strength of the evidence for that belief. All right. The strength of your belief should be proportional to the evidence that you have for the belief. Thus, according to John Locke, a mark of the rational person is, quote, the not entertaining any proposition with greater assurance than the proofs it is built upon will warrant. According to David Hume, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, unquote. In the 19th century, we have W.K. Clifford, who we read earlier, that, quote, delicious enfant terrible, as William James calls him. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not him saying. William James calls Clifford delicious enfant terrible. But he insists that it is wicked, immoral, monstrous, and maybe even impolite to accept a belief for which you do not have sufficient evidence. Quote, and we read him saying this earlier. Whoso would deserve well of his fellows in the matter. All right, I should pause. When we read Clifford, he did make a pretty cool argument that it's immoral, unethical to go around believing things you don't have sufficient evidence for. In the after conversation that was not recorded, we talked about James's response to Clifford. Um, we won't do that right now, but we'll have a chance to look at James's response again, and maybe we'll talk about it later before we end the recording. Okay. But this is Clifford. Whoso would deserve well of his fellows in this matter will guard the purity of his belief with a very fanaticism of jealous care, lest at any time he should rest on it should rest on an unworthy object and catch a stain which can never be wiped away. Even once in your life, if you believe something for which you don't have good evidence, you've become a person more likely to do that in the future. It's like the greatest sin in the world. It's a very extreme position, which was actually very well put, and it was quite moving. However, most atheists don't take up that extreme a position, but it doesn't matter. It's a case that we're going to see addressed here. Okay, and then he adds that if this is Clifford again, a belief has been accepted on insufficient evidence, the pleasure is a stolen one. Not only does it deceive ourselves by giving us a sense of power, which we do not really possess, but it is sinful because it is stolen in defiance of our duty to mankind. That duty is to guard our beliefs from such beliefs as from a pestilence, which may shortly master our body and spread to the rest of the town. His essay is good. I like it. Um, you might detect that there's a hidden logos conversation happening here. But anyway, and finally, to sum up, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. It's another quote of his. It is not hard to detect in these quotations the tone of robustious pathos with which James credits him. Yeah. No, it's actually appreciable too, by the way. Okay. Clifford, of course, held that one who accepts belief in God does accept that belief on insufficient evidence and has therefore defied his duty to mankind. More recently, Bertrand Russell has endorsed the same idea. Quote, give to any hypothesis which is worthy your while to consider, he says, just that degree of credence which the evidence warrants. And in his view, the evidence warrants no credence in the existence of God. Now we're going to move on to another evidentialist. So we're going to definitely stop reading early because we're just going to finish this first section on evidentialism, and that'll be plenty to get into. Okay, so we're going to try to finish part one. Let's see, maybe I can read a little faster. Anthony Flew, The Presumption of Atheism. So now he's going to address that essay that we read earlier, right? Clifford he addressed. Now he's going to address Anthony Flew. Still more recently, Anthony Flew has commended what he calls Clifford's, quote, luminous and compulsive essay. Perhaps compulsive here is to be understood as compelling. And Flew goes on to claim that there is, in his words, a presumption of atheism. What is a presumption of atheism, and why should we think there is one? Flew put it as follows. Now, this is really the important part. Remember, Flew is saying we should presume atheism, wait for evidence to convince us to believe in God. That's where the burden lies, right? We presume the innocence of a guilty, of a potentially guilty, excuse me. We presume the innocence of a charged man, and even the prosecution agrees that that's the way the system should be set up. And then he comes in ready with all of his arguments and evidence to convince us beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Not totally, but just, to convince us that the man's guilty. And then just because we started with the presumption that he was innocent doesn't mean we're not capable of changing our mind. And that's the right state of things on this debate. We also got to see in the after conversation that Anthony Flew did believe in God in that way, or maybe another way. There was a lot of debate we talked about by the end of his life. So he was sincere in all of that. But in any case, Plantinga is now going to discuss Anthony Flew's essay that we read. Flew goes on to claim that there is, in his words, a presumption of atheism. What is a presumption of atheism, and why should we think there is one? Flew puts it as follows. What I want to examine is the contention that the debate about the existence of God should properly begin from the presumption of atheism, that the onus of proof must lie upon the theist. The word atheism, however, has in this contention to be construed unusually, whereas nowadays the usual meaning of atheist in English is someone who asserts that there is no such being as God. I want the word to be understood not positively, but negatively. I want the original Greek preface to be read in the same way that in atheist as it is customarily read in such other Greco-English words as amoral, atypical, asymmetrical. In this interpretation, an atheist becomes not someone who positively asserts the non-existence of God, but someone who is simply not a theist. I don't yet believe. What the protagonist of my presumption, further in that same essay he writes, of atheism wants to show is that the debate about the existence of God ought to be conducted in a particular way, and that the issue should be seen in a certain perspective. His thesis about the onus of proof involves that it is up to the theist, first, to introduce and to define his proposed conception of God, and second, to provide sufficient reason for believing that this concept of his does, in fact, have an application. We just read that earlier. That's what he goes into saying. Okay. How shall we understand this, says Plantinga? What does it mean, for example, to say that the debate should properly begin with the presumption of atheism? What sorts of things do debates begin from? And what is it for one to begin from such a thing? Perhaps Flew means something like this. To speak of where a debate should begin is to speak of the sorts of premises to which the affirmative and negative sides can properly appeal in arguing their cases. Suppose you and I are debating the question whether, say, the United States has a right to seize Mideast oil fields if the OPEC countries refuse to sell us oil at what we think is a fair price. I take the affirmative and produce for my conclusion an argument, one of whose premises is the proposition that the United States has indeed a right to seize these oil fields under those conditions. Doubtless, that maneuver would earn me few points. Similarly, all right, so let's pause. What he's saying is, with any other debate, if the resolution, this House accepts that euthanasia should be legal, right? We could have a big debate. And then you come in for the affirmative side and you say, I've got my arguments for why that's true. And I come in to debate the negative side. I say, I think it should not be legal. And here's why, right? That's just a typical debate about a proposition. He says, now, wait a minute. What if I came into that proposition and I started with a basic belief that my side is right and I don't have to give you any reasons? Obviously, that's not going to be very impressive. I get up to the podium, I go first, and I say, I just start with the belief that my side is right and I don't need reasons to think so. That's not going to be very convincing. Similarly, a debate about the existence of God cannot sensibly start from the assumption that God does indeed exist. It would be absurd. That is to say, the affirmative cannot properly appeal in its arguments to such premises as that there is such a person as God. If she could, she would have much too easy a time of it. So, in this sense of start, Flew is quite right. The debate cannot start from the assumption that God exists. Flew is right. What's Plantinga going to say? He's going to say, we can't have it. We shouldn't have a debate. We shouldn't have a debate. We should just start with belief and then there's no debate because you're right. The debate can't start if we start with the belief as if it's already something that doesn't need to be grounded, but it is something that doesn't need to be grounded. So stop looking for a debate. Okay. I know we're going late here. So let's just finish this section. We won't even get through the evidentialist part of this. Of course, it is also true that the debate cannot start from the assumption that God does not exist. Using atheism in its ordinary sense, there is equally a presumption of atheism. So it looks as if there is, in Flu's sense, a presumption of atheism. All right. But in that same sense, an equal presumption of atheism. If this is what Flu means, then what he says is entirely correct if something of a truism, like a tautology. All right, we're going to wrap this up. Quote, oh, I'm sorry. In other passages, however, Flew seems to understand the proposition of atheism in quite a different fashion. Quote, it is by reference to this inescapable demand for grounds from the proposition of atheism that the proposition of atheism is justified. If it is to be established that there is a God, then we have we have to have good grounds for believing that this is indeed so. Until or unless some such grounds are produced, we have literally no reason at all for believing. And in that situation, the only reasonable posture must be that of either the negative atheist or the agnostic. Well, maybe. I think by negative atheist, he meant weak atheist, but okay. Here we have a claim much more contentious than the mere suggestion that a debate about the existence of God ought to start from the assumption that indeed there is such a person as God. Here, Flew is claiming that it is irrational or unreasonable to accept theistic beliefs in the absence of arguments or evidence for the existence of God. Yeah, that's what he was really talking about. That is, Flew claims that if we know of no propositions that serve as evidence for God's existence, then we cannot rationally believe in God. And of course, Flew, along with Russell, Clifford, and many others, holds that in fact there are no sufficient grounds for evidence for belief in God. Flew therefore seems to be endorsing the following two principles: one, it is six. It is irrational or unreasonable to accept theistic beliefs in the absence of sufficient evidence or reasons. And seven, we have no evidence, or at any rate, not sufficient evidence for the proposition that God exists. Okay, we're going to stop there because it's already getting late and because this is a really long essay. I was hoping we'd get through more, but that's okay. He's not through with the evidentialist part yet. We still have pages for that before he's done. And then he gets on to part two, his dealing with Aquinas and the positive arguments for God's existence. And now that led him to the idea that, wait, this is nonsense. We don't need that. It's properly basic, something like that. So we'll continue following his train of thought later by picking up with Scriven. Atheism is obligatory in the absence of evidence, and the evidentialist objection and intellectual obligation. He's going to talk about all these things, and then can I have intellectual obligations if my beliefs are not within my control? So he's going to talk about all this evidentialist stuff just to set the groundwork for making his case that believing in God or knowing God exists or something like that is properly basic, or knowing that the proposition of personal God exists even without believing in him by putting your trust in me. Put that aside. He's talking about just affirming the proposition. Okay, we're going to go get into the after conversation. I know you and I have some personal fun things to discuss, so I'm going to end the live stream right now, and we'll cut it a little short. Bye, everybody else.